always like to walk out to a good Moog introduction. That's what I like to do. Can you guys hear me all right? Yeah, cool. All right, welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Jason Hanley, Director of Education here at the Rock Hall, and it's a real pleasure to have you all out for this evening's American Musicological Society and Rock and Roll Hall of Fame lecture. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you about a few upcoming events and things we've got going on. First, I'd like to mention the Grateful Dead exhibit. If you haven't been there already, I know a lot of people in the room have probably been there already, but if you're watching out there on the stream, the Grateful Dead exhibit, which will be open for a little while longer here, a fantastic exhibit that fills up the 5th and 6th floor here at the Rock Hall. And also, I'd like to mention a new exhibit that literally just opened this week, the history of British record label Two Tone, some great ska music that came out of England, and a whole new exhibit on that featuring bands like The Specials and Madness. Next week, we've got one more event before we close out 2012. We'll be screening next Wednesday night, a week from today, a film called Color Me Obsessed, a film about the Replacements. A great movie that actually features almost no footage of the Replacements whatsoever. It's a movie entirely about fans and their obsession. The great thing is it actually tells the story of the band through fans telling the story of their experiences with the band. There's still room left for that, so if you go online, you can reserve your seat. It is free, and that will be at an earlier time than usual at 6:30 next Wednesday, and that's because Gorman Beecher, the director, will be here, and he'll intro the film as well as do a Q&A afterwards. Of course, I want to make sure I mention our library and archives. Last night, we had a great event. Peter Carlin, the author of Bruce, the Bruce Springsteen autobiography, was over there last night as part of our author series. And I want to encourage all of you to go and visit the library and archive. If Chuck Berry can do it, so can you. When Chuck Berry was here for our American Music Master series, he actually went over and visited the library and archives and spent some time there. And our guest for tonight, Andy Flory, went over and got his researcher card just last night as well. So, yay for Andy. And hopefully Andy's going to spend some time there over the next couple of days, and we'll be back hopefully to do some more research. The Library and Archives is a great resource if you haven't. One of the things is really exciting. Not only is it a ton of books, research materials, magazines, periodicals, videos, recordings, but also all the events that we've had here over the history of the museum are now there for you to go and view and take a look at. Just to point out to everybody, too, if you want to stay connected to the events that we do, the best way to do that is to become a member of the museum. It both helps support what we do here in the education program, but also gives you advance notice and the ability to sign up for these type of events before the rest of the general public. But if you're just interested in even hearing more about what we're doing here, you can email us at education@rockhall.org and find out a little bit of what we're doing. We send out a newsletter, usually about once a week or every other week. All right, so this evening, I'm really proud, again, to be here at our 3rd American Musicological Society and Rock Hall lecture in our lecture series. This is something we started and has been really fantastic, bringing scholars in musicology and music history to the museum to talk to a general audience as well as musicologists about scholarly research that's going on, but to think about it in context of what we do here at the museum at the Rock Hall, and also to connect up to the library and archives. I should also mention that the previous 2 lectures, the first one done by Albin Zach, and then the last one we had here done by David Brackett, both of those are now available on the American Musicological Society website. And I'm also going to make a plug out there for any musicologists here in the audience or ones out there watching on the stream that you can propose a topic for future lectures. And we've actually got a deadline here on December 17th for a spring lecture. So if anybody's listening who's interested, you can go to the ams-net.org website and take a look there and send in a proposal. So we'd be happy to have folks send those in. And even if you're an AMS member and you know somebody else who you'd like to kind of nominate, who maybe we should be talking to about being part of this series, please let us know. So now let me introduce the Vice President of Education and Public Programs, Dr. Lauren Anke, who will officially introduce our guest for tonight.
Thank you, Jason. Jason's responsible for developing the relationship between the museum and the AMS, and I really thank him for his hard work in making this lecture series a reality. We're really proud of it. It's been a very productive partnership, and we look forward to a long relationship with the AMS here. I also want to acknowledge our president, Terry Stewart, who's there at the back of the room, who supported this idea from the very beginning as he supported all of our educational initiatives. And when we brought it to him, he said, absolutely, we would love to have that kind of dialogue. And as many of you know, Terry will be stepping down as of January 1. And so, Terry, thank you for making this happen. Our guiding principle in the education programs here at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum is to effectively teach the history of rock and roll and related styles to multiple audiences, which we do every day in this room, right? Elementary and high school students, college students, and the general public, from fans to record collectors to independent scholars. Sounds great, right? Sounds like it might be easy. No. We all know that the challenges of that kind of pedagogical philosophy are really built in. The discourses surrounding those communities are rarely mutually intelligible. And if you've ever seen a record collector face off against a scholar, it can get downright ugly. Especially over issues of expertise, right, and how we define expertise. This is hard work, and it needs our best thinkers, so we welcome and applaud the AMS objective for its efforts to bring musicology scholarship to a broader audience. And Dr. Andy Flory is one of the best practitioners of this kind of work. Flory received his PhD in musicology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2006. After teaching for several years at Shenandoah University, he's now an assistant professor of music history at Carleton College in Massachusetts, where he's also affiliated with American Studies and African American Studies. He's published significant essays on Marvin Gaye and Motown, co-authored with John Kovach the third edition of What's That Sound? An Introduction to Rock and Its History, a really important rock and roll textbook, and insightful essays for 2 volumes of the complete Motown singles, a comprehensive recorded history of Motown records. Flory's book, I Hear a Symphony, Listening to the Music of Motown, is forthcoming from the University of Michigan Press. Trouble Man, the album, is a significant project in the career of Marvin Gaye, and it really marks a lot of things in his career and I think his creativity. Marvin Gaye was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, which was only the 2nd year of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So we acknowledge his importance right from the beginning. Trouble Man was his first project after What's Going On, which was his break from the standards of Motown production and songwriting. It also represents Motown's move to California and its venture into films. On it, Gaye worked with a studio orchestra and brought a range of styles to the soundtrack, from church hymns to jazz to African rhythms. The material that's now available on the reissue that Andy put together, the additional bonus tracks from the session and the original film score together, demonstrate Gaye's range at what was probably, I think, the height of his creativity. And the great Let's Get It On was to follow in 1973. As both a musicologist and a reissue producer, Flory provides a model for the productive impact of musicology in popular music at a time when the pop music industry and institutions like ours are turning more and more to the past for product on the market and for ways to tell the story of rock and soul music. His use of archival sound sources as a source of research and his facility with analyzing their significance engages a very broad public indeed. So please welcome to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum, Andy Flory.
So I'd just like to quickly start by thanking Jason and Lauren and Terry, the entire education department here, Bob Judd in the AMS. It's a fantastic collaboration that the Rock Hall and the AMS have fostered here, and it takes work and a lot of thought, and I think they've done a good job. It's off to a good start, and let's hope that it continues. This talk will consider the role of the musicologist as reissue producer. Several years ago, I was approached by Universal Music to provide musicological assistance with a reissue of Marvin Gaye's Trouble Man, as Lauren said, an album closely related to a 1972 Blaxploitation film soundtrack, also composed by Gaye. The process of completing this work gave me a fascinating glimpse into the world of the modern reissue producer. a rarely discussed agent responsible for creating historical documents of past releases for the modern marketplace. There are three sections to my presentation today. First, I will discuss the role of public scholarship in musicology, especially in regard to popular music studies. The second part of my talk will consider the reissue itself and detail my experiences working on the Trouble Man project. Finally, I will offer some reflections on the idea of musicologist as reissue producer. I should start by saying that it's great to be here. When people begin talks in this manner, it is often a way to break the ice or provide some early connection with the audience. In fact, this statement really gets to the heart of my talk. It's great for me, an academic musicologist that focuses on American popular music, to be here at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, perhaps the most visible institution in the world that seeks to educate the public about rock music. While it may not seem novel to those outside of academia that I would be speaking here this evening, in fact, this talk is a prime example of what those in higher education often call public or engaged scholarship. Public scholarship is sort of an awkward term. If some scholarship is public, one may ask, does that mean there is such a thing as private scholarship? In fact, much of what academics discuss in professional meetings and publish in specialist journals and for university presses is not meant for consumption by the general public and is often esoteric. In this sense, then, public scholarship is professional work performed by trained academics that seeks to engage a group outside of traditional academic fields. The first type of public scholarship that may come to mind is the talking head on national television programs, or perhaps the scholar whose academic writing is palatable to the general public and receives attention in national newspapers, or may even be featured on NPR's Weekend Edition or Fresh Air. These are certainly forms of public scholarship, but they often fall under the more relevant term public intellectual. To be sure, there is a much larger and intricate history of academics working in the public sphere, many of whom are not visible on Charlie Rose or in the New York Times. A common benchmark of public work within modern academic circles dates to the 1990 publication of Ernest Boyer's Scholarship Reconsidered, which advocated for four types of scholarship, one of which he called scholarship of application, and this was a really big deal when it came out. Boyer and the many intellectuals that have followed in his stead, including those involved in the large Imagining America initiative, have focused a lot of energy on models for academics to get credit for scholarship of application, which is probably less interesting to us here than what academics actually do outside of the ivory tower. Before delving into my own experiences, it will be helpful to ask some questions about public scholarship in music and consider some of the groundwork for the field. Like our perceptions of the public intellectual, we may want to consider our preconceptions of the ways in which music academics might engage a larger public. Surely, many of you have experienced a curtain talk before a classical music concert, which is one of the simplest methods of musicological engagement. But many musicologists perform public scholarship in other ways, including writing liner notes, editing performance and study editions of music scores, writing books for the general reader, writing for newspapers and submitting op-ed pieces, blogging, leading performance groups, and advocating for public policy awareness. Discussions of broader application within musicology are nearly as old as the American Musicological Society itself, which was formed in 1934. An early proponent of what he called applied musicology was Charles Seeger, one of the founders of the AMS, who wrote significantly on the topic during the first decades of the society. In the opening paper of the International Congress of Musicology in New York City in 1939, the first page of which you see here, Seeger discussed the many government-sponsored musicological activities of the time, including the Library of Congress Music Division, the Smithsonian, the WPA Federal Music Program, and even the Federal Communications Commission. He questioned the role of music researchers in these emerging opportunities for facilitating and regulating music in Washington, asking, if musicology does not define the field of music, what else will? As someone who worked outside of academia for nearly 2 decades in the middle of his career, Seeger seemed particularly attuned to these issues. Although many musicologists have followed Seeger's path into applied fields during the past 60 years, much of the intradisciplinary discussion of public scholarship in music has occurred under the auspices of the Society for Ethnomusicology, which formed in 1955 with Seeger as founding member. The extent to which Seeger's concept of applied musicology is at the core of modern ethnomusicology was discussed by Tony Seeger, Charles's nephew and one of the most prominent ethnomusicologists of his generation, during the keynote lecture of the 2005 50th anniversary of the National Meeting for the Society for Ethnomusicology. To make matters even more confusing, the lecture is called the Seeger Lecture. Right? One Seeger giving a lecture for another Seeger. Within his larger argument, Tony listed 10 types of applied ethnomusicology that are common among today's researchers. But the crux of his talk concerned the absence of lineage for those who choose to spend considerable energy working outside of academia. Focusing on Alan Lomax, Tony reflected on the ethnomusicological family members missing from the field during a time of reunion. In short, he found that Lomax, a founder of modern ethnomusicology, had in large part been forgotten because he spends so much energy working outside of academia. We see in this example the dark underbelly of public scholarship. While it seems obvious that academics should work to achieve maximum relevancy, the ramifications of this type of work for those who are employed within the academy can be quite serious. It is no coincidence that ethnomusicologists tend to work in a more engaged manner, as the discipline itself is based on anthropological methods. The reasons for this seem to be encoded into the field. Many ethnomusicological subjects are alive and productive, and therefore researchers need to account for their role in the music-making process. There's a similar challenge for the larger field of popular music studies, which is largely comprised of academics that work on popular music of the last 60 years. Pop music studies both within and outside of musicology is now decades old, with a large body of literature and methodological considerations of its own. Yet, one of the most pressing and underaddressed issues in the larger scholarship of pop music is the role of public engagement. Different than the historical musicologist who works on opera, or the music theorist that analyzes structures in new music, the popular music scholar studies music that is often well-liked among a large public that is not engaged with the academy. There is a huge audience outside of academia for popular music, which begs many questions of the scholar that deals with this music. Namely, what role should the historical musicologist play in the larger conception of popular music and its history? Should we aim our work squarely at the ivory tower, or is there room to engage with a larger public about our ideas? Certainly, many scholars of pop music are publicly engaged. Journalism is a common method for connecting to a larger public, and it isn't uncommon to see a musicologist as a talking head on a documentary or television special. There's a long history of this in jazz scholarship, with figures such as Dan Morgenstern working as both academics and industry historians. Country music scholar Bill Malone has also maintained throughout his storied career equal stature in both academia and commercial production. And recently, 19th century popular music expert Dale Cockrell turned to public applications to further the cause of his research on the music of Laura Ingalls Wilder, starting a record company and producing a televised concert with big-name country acts. The education department here at the Rock Hall is a good example of this type of work. The entire staff has academic training in music research, which is being applied in an outreach capacity at the museum through a close relationship through local academic institutions. The same can be said for the efforts of the Experience Music Project's Pop Festival, which brings together a variety of music scholars to talk about their work every year. And there are myriad examples of pop music experts entering academia on a part-time basis in later career stages after working in the industry for a significant time. Despite examples like this, though, popular music offers challenges to the academic because, unlike Western art music from centuries past, pop music has its own completely separate ecosystem of criticism and historical production. In short, it looks from the outside as if the popular music industry doesn't really need musicologists to forward the public dialogue. Looking at the scholarly literature, the converse also seems to be true, that academics don't really need to participate in the industry. This perspective probably has its roots in the British origins of popular music studies in the late 1970s and early 80s, which was fostered by a group of writers who were generally, should we say, wary of capitalism. To better understand the relationship between pop music studies and the music industry, I thumbed through back issues of the seminal journal Popular Music in preparation for this talk and found lots of writing about the music business, but little that discussed any sort of scholarly participation in the music industry. I think you can probably see where I'm going with this. Despite the fact that the pop music industry and popular music studies operate mostly in isolation, it seems that they have a lot to offer one another. As the music industry creates its own story, who better than to help shape the history of popular music than musicologists? The words of Charles Seeger certainly resonate here. If we don't accept that challenge, then someone else will. I'm going to take the rest of my time to talk about one particular avenue for possible collaboration between musicologists and the music business, the reissue. If you're in this room or taking the time to watch over the internet, you probably know all about reissues, so I won't take much time to explain what they are. In short, multinational record companies are largely divided into two divisions at the macro level. One of these deals with the front line of current hit-making artists. The other deals with all of the assets owned by the company, or what is commonly called catalog. These assets are valuable, and record companies profit immensely from repackaging past releases in various ways to sell old material. Now, for those anti-capitalists in the room, this may seem like a filthy and disgusting world. To be sure, there are a lot of unfortunate and unnecessary reissues released every Tuesday, but there are also fantastic examples, and in the best cases, the form is a powerful method of conveying history. Reissues have been commonplace at least since the advent of the LP. With a longer length of LPs, many record companies revisited their older single releases during the early 1960s, creating new compilations of greatest hits and artist retrospectives. Classical and jazz were especially rich markets for this during the 1960s and 1970s, with erudite collectors interested in scholarly presentations of old recordings with extensive notes and discographical research. These releases became a significant part of the music business, even garnering a Grammy category for Best Historical Album in 1979 to accompany the Best Album Notes award that had been awarded since the early 1960s. Many more reissues emerged during the slow shift from LPs and cassettes to compact discs during the 1980s. During this movement came the real watershed for historically representing popular music, the box set. Conventional wisdom holds that the first important rock box set of this era was Bob Dylan's Biograph, released in 1985. Like jazz and classical before, post-war pop such as rock, R&B, and country entered into an era of retrospection during this period. Now, the reissue was more than a simple transfer of an older album. It became a creative endeavor of portraying history. There were many tropes: the complete works of a performer, a selection of several hours worth of greatest hits, an expose on a single record company, or even a close look at a particular region. The possibilities seem staggering for recombining and unearthing old material. Another of the tricks of these sets was to include new music that had never been released. Adding alternate takes, discarded material, extended versions, and live performances became a method of luring buyers, but also enabled deeper historical renderings and revisionism. These sets were created by a new type of agent in the music business, serving under the titles of reissue producer, archivist, discographer, and liner note author. Figures like Bill Levinson, Andy McKay, Thane Tierney, Bill Inglett, Greg Geller, and Andrew Sandoval became the historians of pop music, much like Phil Schaap and Michael Cuscuno were for jazz. And the trend toward historicization in popular music has continued to thrive in the 90s, 2000s, and 10s, marking a steep curve in the record business toward lionizing the music of the past. Each of the three major label conglomerates, Sony, Universal, and Warner, now has divisions and subsets like Legacy, Hippo, and Rhino to release catalog material. While these marquee releases make up a large part of the reissue market every year, some of the most interesting work in the last decade has emerged from independent reissue labels that license material from larger entities. Seattle-based Light in the Attic, Chicago-based Numero Group, and Atlanta-based Dust to Digital have released stunningly extensive sets, garnered press and awards, and appealed to both aging baby boomers and hipsters alike. This is all very important historical work, and virtually none of the people who do it are academics. Thus, Seeger's challenge becomes more concrete and more acute. Music histories are appearing in print every week using a fascinating array of primary sources. Shouldn't musicologists want to contribute to these releases? Now, I'm not completely naive about this. I understand that there are significant steps that even the willing musicologist must take to do this type of work. Becoming established in the industry takes time, and the music business does not conform to the rules of academic society. There are no calls for papers, there's no peer review, and record company executives don't exactly post their contact information online and hold office hours. In fact, it can take a lot of work to simply find collaborators and earn their trust. Moreover, the power structure in the modern industry is very different than in academia, and circulation of knowledge is not necessarily free. All of these issues can be incredibly frustrating for a community of scholars that meets openly, publishes transparently, and conforms to long-standing codes of engagement. From late 2008 until several weeks ago, I worked with Universal Music, the parent company of Motown Records, on a reissue of Marvin Gaye's 1972 album, Trouble Man. It may be helpful to chronicle some of my experiences in order to paint a fuller picture of one particular collaborative effort between musicology and the music industry. Beginning nearly a decade ago when I was in graduate school, I began to foster a relationship with Harry Weinger, the reissue producer responsible for overseeing the Motown catalog. I slowly engendered his trust, writing liner notes for several releases, and meeting with him several times while visiting New York. During an informal email conversation in 2008, he mentioned work on an expanded edition of Marvin Gaye's Trouble Man, and that he was, in a sense, stuck. Living in Virginia at the time, I responded with a deal. Send me copies of the tapes, and I will help you with the project. After receiving 11 digitized reels of multi-track tape and high-quality scans of all tape boxes, ephemera, and reels, or what the industry calls metadata, I set to work on the project. Harry was no amateur, having produced hundreds of reissues for Polygram and later Universal since the early 1990s. He was confounded for a very good reason. A curious puzzle in the extant Trouble Man tapes that no one could seem to completely figure out. The Trouble Man that everyone knew, the one released as an LP in late 1972, was an album that stemmed from a soundtrack scored by Gaye for a Blaxploitation film of the same name. Yet Gaye's album was very different from the cues that actually appeared in the film, which became apparent to many fans upon the release of the film DVD in 2006. There were 5 reels of film music in the Universal vaults, but none of the cues match exactly the music in the movie. As it turned out, there was a missing link. Universal didn't have a finished copy of the edited cues for the film as prepared by the music editor. Instead, the existing tapes were of the pre-edited material used to create these cues. Harry got a copy of the actual soundtrack off of the film stock for reference, but it had horrible sound quality and lots of dialogue and sound effect leakage. But after listening to this material, it was clear that Gaye's original film soundtrack was a very special part of his output and needed to be part of any expanded edition of the album. So my first job then was to scour the 5 reels of original session tapes to find the bits and pieces needed to reconstruct over 40 minutes of original music from the film. To give you a sense of this process, I'd like to play you one particularly natty cue that is about 1 minute long. So first, let's watch the scene in the film from which the cue comes, and then I'll show you the editing process. And I have to apologize. This is a Blaxploitation film, so it's sort of funny. You might laugh. But listen to the music, because then we'll look at how the music was created. there you go. Now let's look at the editing required to create this cue, which I completed with a colleague in Virginia named Adam Olson. Notice, when I flip the slide, it's going to start playing. Notice the vertical lines separating the horizontal plane of each track. Each of these little segments represents a point of edit, with much of the source material coming from different places within the original 5 reels. Come on now. This is the barroom music. There we go. Then there was Gaye's work with the album, which was represented on the other 6 reels of tape in the vault. On these reels, he cut and pasted the film cues and interleaved them with new sessions and overdubs. There were tracking sessions with a Motown backing band, and 2 composite reels that Gaye and Motown engineers like Art Stewart and Russ Tarana compiled to represent each side of the album. Harry suggested that I evaluate this material for performances that did not appear on the original album, outtakes, extra tracks, muted performances, and the like. And there was plenty of this to be found, including extended versions of several songs, alternate vocal takes, string tracks not incorporated into the original versions, and scratch vocal tracks for several of the song's instrumental pieces. I learned a lot about the project in this segment of my work. For one, the session tapes revealed a more nuanced history surrounding the relationship of this album to What's Going On, which was released 18 months before. Because the final Trouble Man album was mostly instrumental, most critics and historians over the last 40 years have viewed the project as a reflection of Gaye's anxiety toward the reception of What's Going On. But the tapes revealed evidence of Gaye attempting more vocal parts than were on the final release. His process of composing the vocal element of his work, which I had explored in my dissertation and later published as an article called Marvin Gaye as Vocal Composer, usually followed a process in which he scattered over a completed backing track to develop melodic and lyrical ideas. And in fact, there were several sets of unfinished lyrics of this type included in these sessions. The most notable was comprised in several takes of the song T Stands for Trouble, which had no vocals on the final album. On the session tapes, however, there were 2 full tracks of Gaye experimenting with a vocal element for the song. In the end, these tracks revealed that Gaye either tried harder than most people thought to establish vocal parts for Trouble Man, or that he simply ran out of time to complete them. So I'll play you one version of T Stands for Trouble that I found in the original vaults. In this track, Gaye riffs off of the lyrics from the famous Trouble Man single. If you know that single, you'll hear that he's using those words. He riffs on them over a different backing track, though, which is a classic example of his vocal composition process. So, again, to reiterate, on the released record, there are no vocal parts, and you'll hear him singing on this. And those of you who know the Trouble Man single will realize that about a minute in, he starts to actually stray from the Trouble Man lyrics and sort of venturing into new territory. See what's going to play.
Cut to T. Why is the tempo right up front there? You're doing something a little different.
This is actually, I wanted to tell you this too. Him talking here is evidence that he was present during the tracking session. So this doesn't come from the vocal session. There was a tracking session with a backing band and then lots of overdubs, including his own vocals. So this shows us that Gaye was more involved in the process than simply having someone record the backing tracks and then coming in to do his own vocals.
Time-wise.
Another fascinating realization that came out of this process was the creative work behind the song T Plays It Cool. I was especially interested in the sources for this song. It's a really popular song, and upset to find that there was little to go on in the material, in the tape material and metadata. I couldn't find evidence of a Motown band or film session at which the song was recorded, and the final take was pasted at the end of a reel, out of sequence with the rest of the album. So you can see it here. It says at the end, Jimmy's Tune is what it was called. It was the working title. It's pasted at the end of the reel. It's sort of like tagged on to the end. It didn't really make any sense. The reason for this only occurred to me when actually looking at the multi-tracks for the final session in Pro Tools. Then it became obvious. There was no session information for a backing band material because the backing band hadn't actually recorded the track. The backing tracks were created by cutting and pasting a segment from the film band sessions to create a loop. Visually, it was easy to see that the 4-bar segment was repeated throughout the song in a way that was virtually impossible for a live band to accomplish. Over this loop, Gaye laid down hand clap and gyro overdubs and Moog tracks, and saxophonist Trevor Lawrence improvised melody lines throughout. So let's look at this. This is what it looks like on Pro Tools. And if you look at the top 5 tracks, the ones with the little yellow squares on the left, especially the second one down from the top, you can see that it's just, I highlighted one of the sections so you can see how big the repeated section is. It's just a 4-bar loop that they literally did an old school cut and paste and made a long sort of jam out of it. And interestingly, T Plays It Cool is a really popular source for breakbeat samples. And so it's a loop that has been sampled into a loop. This is what the loop sounds like. So this is just the top 5 tracks, and I'll give you a couple repetitions of it. It's also, we know that it came from the film band sessions because of the way it was recorded. The film band sessions were only recorded on 6 tracks, and instruments were combined in very odd ways. You know, they use a sort of old school way to record the music, and so the lineage of these from the film band sessions is clear. So this is what the loop sounds like. Repeats for about 5 minutes in the track. And interestingly, they tried a couple of different loops. This is the most successful one, and they're all pasted on the end of the reel. There's a bridge in this song that ended up being cut out. This is what T Plays It Cool sounds like on the record. It starts with this stately sort of horn introduction that comes from the film band sessions, and then just goes right into the loop. And you'll hear the loop underneath, and then all the various Moog and saxophone and hand clap overdubs on top of it. Marvin clapping. That's enough of T Plays It Cool. It's a great track. The process of exploring original Marvin Gaye session tapes that had not seen the light of day for nearly 40 years was exhilarating, to say the least. It required a lot of detective work and knowledge about the recording techniques, the history and inner workings of Motown, the session musicians from Los Angeles, all things that were related to my academic research. Exploring the tapes was one thing, but helping to construct a release, to create, in a sense, an oral portrait of Gaye at work in 1972 was a daunting task that it enlightened me to many of the challenges of reissue work. For one, the process of collaborative editing was unlike anything I had experienced in academic circles. In this instance, even though, keep doing that, sorry. Even though my name was on the main essay in the liner notes, and I had done the primary research for the piece, Harry was highly involved in the editing process, and I felt at times like I was losing control of my own work. But there were positives to this as well, in the end, that far outweighed the negatives. Working with one of the most knowledgeable Motown experts in the world greatly improved my work. Harry found errors, questioned many of my claims, and suggested ways to improve the framing of the piece. We went back and forth about items in the essay in a way that I've never done with academic editors, who often know much less about my subject and don't feel a particular sense of urgency about my topic. Another challenge stemmed from the multi-track state of the tapes. Much different than jazz or classical sessions in which the recording process simply documents a live performance, Gaye used recording as a creative tool. Thus, as we have seen in several examples today, the tapes were messy, with differing levels and timbres, and the restoration process needed a heavy hand. For me, this invoked a range of choices that aesthetician Mark Sagoff described in his 1978 article on restoring and reproducing art. In this seminal piece, Sagoff discusses the differences between what he calls purist and integral restoration. And this has to do with art, but I'm applying it to music here. As an objective musicologist, I wanted to stay as far out of the creative process as possible, creating what Sagoff calls a purist restoration, by being completely transparent and adding nothing to Gaye's tapes. No reverb, no compression, and panning organized specifically to present the listener with the sound of the original multitracks. My engineer colleague Adam Olson and I even went so far as to mix several of the tracks in this manner. Harry didn't very much like these mixes, and after working in the studio with him and remix engineer John Morales, I quickly realized why. His goal was to provide what Segoff calls an integral restoration of Gaye's recording, in which we filled in the missing work to complete Gaye's project. An example of this is apparent on an alternate version of the song Main Theme for Trouble Man 2, which included a never-before-heard set of Gaye's backing vocals. In mixing this work, Harry and John adjusted levels in ways that obscured some performances and highlighted others, added copious amounts of reverb, and at times aligned and manipulated the two vocal tracks. Here's a comparison of my purest restoration of Gaye's alternate take of Main Theme for Trouble Man 2 and the integral restoration that appeared on the officially released expanded edition, which was released several weeks ago. So I'll play them back to back. You have to listen really closely to hear the differences between the two. So here's my mix, which isn't as good. Here's John's mix. Clearly, the release mix is of a higher quality in terms of listenability. In addition to the skill of the mixing engineer, these differences have to do with the willingness to inject creativity in a way that might make academics uncomfortable. The rationale for this integral approach was simple. Most fans don't buy Marvin Gaye records to study individual performances and hear errors. Consumers want things that sound like completed records, not works in progress. This raised serious consideration of ethics on my part. At times I would think, I'm a white man from Ohio. I have no business making creative decisions on a Marvin Gaye record. It seemed that there was a reason that many of these alternate takes and extended versions were not included on the original album. Was it unethical to release Gaye's unfinished work in this way? Throughout the process, there were two things in particular that assuaged these pangs of impropriety. The first was the excitement that I felt anytime I heard one of these unreleased performances, especially the instrumental suite of film cues reconstructed for the project. Although created as an integral restoration with editorial input from our team, I came to view the expanded edition as a historical unearthing, a type of scholarly addition. With clear demarcation on the final release that these sessions were edited ex post facto and detailed liner notes explaining the history of the release, revealing these tracks seemed no different than publishing the sketches of a classical music composer, which is commonplace in the musicological field. Another comforting factor was Harry's correspondence and dealings with Jan Gaye, which he shared with me on several occasions. There are certainly many who could justifiably claim to be the holder of Gaye's creative legacy. As Marvin's second wife, however, Jan has been the most involved in his affairs, and although not integral to the decisions of the project, Jan was aware and supportive of our work. To close, I'd like to offer several reflections on the idea of musicologist as reissue producer and the related topic of popular music studies and public scholarship. The first concerns the reissue as a critical edition. While book-length studies of particular albums have increased in popularity during the last decade, the primary sources of popular music are the records themselves. And reissues that delve into the process of creating an album can offer innumerable insights into this work. In a 2005 article called Editioning Rock, Albin Zak explored the issue of the rock edition. As a type of fantastical exercise, he provided a list of items that might comprise a rock edition, including original recordings, transcriptions, available scores and lead sheets, historical analysis, and critical commentary on performance practice and production techniques. As we have seen, and as many of you know, many of these elements are often incorporated into current reissues, but others are not. Thus, most reissues approach the idea of an edition, but fall short from what scholars and performers might want and need to study a given project. Nevertheless, notable comparisons between reissues and editions show us that, in a sense, the box set reissue may be the closest thing that pop music and jazz have to scholarly explication. Another reflection surrounds the ways in which my Troubleman experience radically changed my view of using primary sources in popular music studies. As a general rule, pop music scholars do not work heavily with archival sound sources, exploring instead methodologies involving ethnographic work, historical exploration using documentary evidence from print media, or critical readings of commercial releases. The use of these approaches, especially in musicology, is inextricable from the state of the field when popular music entered the discourse. In a sense, popular music was one of the most important topics that fostered the development of critical voices in musicology during the 1980s, a perspective that sought to move away from a stricter tradition of archival discovery, or what Joseph Kerman famously called positivism. Contrary to this tradition, I think of myself now as a proud positivist, and believe my experience with Troubleman shows that there is room for greater presence of archival sound work in pop music studies. The largest problem with this traditionally has been access, yet important collections have emerged in the last decades at various archives, and private collectors have begun to realize the historical significance of archival materials. By far, the most significant development in this has been the opening of the Rock Hall Library and Archives. Through a combination of financial resources, name recognition, industry context, and savvy development, this collection has been, even in its very short existence, has become easily the finest archive in the world for primary sources relating to popular music. Still, I'm surprised at the current paucity of primary recordings in this collection, especially multi-track sources. To be sure, commercial audio and video sources pose serious challenges for librarians, researchers, and lawyers. And I'm glad to know that the Rock Hall Library and Archives staff are beginning to approach these issues. After establishing a useful model, I very much hope that in the future this and other archives might feature more musical sources like the ones I was able to explore in this reissue of Troubleman. While many of us would be thrilled to see the Rock Hall serve as a conduit between the music industry and academia, there may also be more room for scholars to go directly to the source. From my perspective, I've seen the willingness of the music industry to work with individual partners change rapidly in the last decade, as evidence in the spate of independent reissue labels that are releasing high-quality material owned by large conglomerates. In my view, it wouldn't be out of the question for the American Musicological Society or the Society for American Music to sponsor a reissue label, in the same manner that these societies support the MUSA and AMS Studies publication series. An effort such as this may make inroads into other opportunities for engaged scholarship. For one, using a model like Tim and Denise Duffy's Music Maker Relief Foundation, musicologists might take a more active role in advocating for musicians and their families, involving them in the processes of releasing back catalog material and assisting in legal affairs. Moreover, in line with the current work of Tim Brooks, musicologists might become more involved in the issues of back catalog copyright, which Brooks has found may have devastating ramifications on our future research. Increased involvement with the music industry could have a marked effect on the trajectory of popular music studies. Academics can offer a lot to a music business that is increasingly focused on the past, while benefiting by gaining access to proprietary resources. One avenue for this relationship is the reissue, which as a historical endeavor can dramatically enhance musicological study of popular music. We should foster closer relationships with reissue producers and lessen the gap between this historical wing of the music industry and popular music studies. As I learned during the process of creating the expanded edition of Troubleman, there's much to gain from venturing into public scholarship. And as I speak from a perch at an institution that blends public and academic views on the history and significance of rock music, I am assured that the trajectory of popular music studies is moving in a fruitful direction. Thank you. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them or address them. Crickets chirping.
Andy, that was great. Thank you. You said something about that, the process of putting the tracks together, and you said you got uncomfortable at a certain point about losing control, right? And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit about how much a project like this required real collaboration, and how sometimes maybe academic work doesn't, right? So is that part of what's going on? Your sense of losing control was actually what this work requires compared to kind of doing a book or a dissertation?
Yeah, I mean, Dan could probably speak to this too, because we happen to have in the audience one of the only people in the field who has experience other than me. This is my perspective. I think the rules are different. I think we have very established, even though they can become frustrating and it takes a long time to learn how things work in academia, we do have these sort of understood codes for what an editor does, what a journal editor does, and what a peer reviewer does, and what an author does when your name is on the project. And I think the codes are different in this world. I don't think they're better or worse. I was more uncomfortable losing control over the writing part of it. The audio work is, when he said, I don't like your mixes, of course, I'm not an audio engineer, so, I didn't expect him to like my mixes. But I do write historical pieces, and so to have someone really reading closely and questioning and getting drafts back with facts inserted into them, that's not something that happens when you're an academic. But I learned to be very appreciative. The facts inserted were right, and they were good. And so then the question became, and there has been this tension, as Harry and I have worked together, and I'd be interested to hear him reflect on this. I should have him here, on whether or not he feels this tension with all of his collaborators, because he has lots of collaborators. I'm one of many, and even lots of academic collaborators, mainly for liner notes, not necessarily for the audio source stuff. But this tension arose at one point of who was actually doing the work. And in one of our essays, actually, it's credited to us both. Because he actually stepped in so much and added so much to the essay, it became a sort of co-authored piece. But in academics, that doesn't happen from an editorial perspective. When you start writing a piece, the editor doesn't halfway through become your co-author. Many of them, I think, would probably like to. So yeah, it's a different world, but it's a productive world. As I said in the paper, having somebody who knows so much be willing to really engage with your piece and read it over and over again and really comb it for details, because as you sort of joked at the beginning, the difference between the record collector and the academic, record collectors are going to read this stuff, and they're going to know if you make mistakes, and they want new things, and they know a lot of information. And so you have to be right, or you lose trust very, very quickly. So in a certain sense, it's a different level of quality, but in a certain sense, it's sort of a higher level of quality, you know, because people don't just take your word for it, you know.
I mean, this is great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Brought back a lot of memories.
Yeah.
I think you're hitting it right on the head. Is you've got someone like, well, the person you work with who lives with this material in a way that the academic doesn't, where they are working with the tape boxes and they're seeing how they're physically laid out and maybe looking at something that has been touched in 40 years and can actually have that kind of understanding of really what was going on at the sessions, may have been at the sessions or may have known someone at the sessions. And as academics, we're trained to think about things just differently. And one of those things is nobody messes with our writing.
Right.
And so when someone comes in and says, well, actually, there's all these things you need to think about, who may or may not be a record collector, but certainly is going to have that mentality, suddenly you say, maybe I need to be listening to these things. Because they're only going to improve the final product. And I think that may answer one of your questions as to why more of this isn't happening, because a lot of academics, I suspect, just either aren't interested or wouldn't understand that approach, or it just may not compute.
It's scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be scary.
And that kind of leads to the question I wanted to put to you, which is, I think another reason why this hasn't happened more is that it is, as you point out, very recent. It's really only in the last 10, 15 years that this kind of work has been done. And what I ran into repeatedly, and I wondered if you had run into, was the why bother? As in, why do we need to get someone like this involved? You know, I have 50 names on my Rolodex of people who write for Rolling Stone or write for Mojo or write for other places who are writers who can write whatever I want them to
in
for a set amount of money.
Right.
Why do I need to bother with an academic who I'm going to have to edit anyway?
Right.
So did you run into this, especially when you first started working with him?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I'm speaking for him again. But if I hadn't done this, the person who he would have called, who would have turned it around in 48 hours, is David Ritz, who is the Marvin Gaye. I mean, he co-wrote Sexual Healing. How could you be closer to Marvin Gaye than, you know? I mean, he wrote the collaborative biography that turned into a biography after Marvin was tragically killed. So, and I've talked to David about it a little bit. Not that much. I think David's very supportive of it. I think he turned to me because there was this tape work to be done. And it started with me working on the tapes. And you know, there are lots of parts of this that I didn't bring up. I'll talk about two things that you just mentioned. So he really wanted me to sort out the tapes because I was a musicologist. I mean, things were in different keys, and you know, all of this editing work we can do because we deal with music. You know, when you study Wagner scores and you know, study opera, and you know, you really listen to 20th century music, you can do these things, and you have a different type of memory for these things. And then what happened was I started working this into my own work. You know, I have a book coming out on mine. I was working on a book on Motown at the same time, and this is one of the really fruitful aspects of this, that all of a sudden in the middle of this book project, here I was dumped all of this primary source material, and it just so happened that I needed to reflect on Motown's move to Los Angeles in 1972, and this was perfect. It was a really great case study for one of Motown's marquee artists' first project in Los Angeles. It was a film soundtrack. And so I started writing about it. I mean, I started really working on, I did the audio work. It took a long time for this to come to fruition because they needed to wait for the 40th anniversary, because that's the way the music business works. There has to be an anniversary for it to come out, right? It's true, we laugh, but so, you know, as I was waiting on these things, I started writing about it for my work, and I sent the essay to Harry, and he said, wow, this is it. I don't need to call anybody else. I've got the essay. So in that case, the time was my friend. I think some of that had to do with the trust that we'd been building for a long time, and it's taken almost a decade to build that trust, for him to really send me tapes and trust that I'm not going to mess the project up. people are becoming, I think the record industry people, the EMP and the Rock Hall, I think are piquing the interests of people who work in the industry. I mean, there are separate spheres. The Venn diagram doesn't cross over very much, but I think, I mean, the interest is, the lack of interest isn't there. I mean, people really, they want to explore each other's world. We're fascinated with the industry. I mean, after I started working on this, everybody that I met at conferences, that's all they wanted to talk about. Like, tell me more about this Trouble Man thing. How did you get those tapes? And I think there's a little vice versa. You know, when someone who's a reissue producer starts venturing into the academic world, they become really interested in how it could work. But we're scared of each other's worlds, and there needs to be a little bit more fostering. So then I reflect on the second thing very quickly. I think the reason that this is opening up in the way that it is because of the decline of the business and the decline of sales. And a lot of it has to do with, I mean, labels like Numero Group and Dust to Digital probably wouldn't be able to do what they do now 20 years ago. But they're able to get these agreements and license this music because you know, the larger conglomerates are happy to farm some of these things out while physical copies are still being sold, and there's still a little bit of a market for these box sets. And then, you know, after the first wave comes where they're able to do these things, you start to see the results, and these box sets are fantastic, and people want them on their shelves, so they're willing to license the music out and let it go. So it's interesting to watch the trajectory of it from, you know, Biograph and the Clapton Crossroads box sets. These first, you know, I read a bunch of reviews of those things to prep for this talk to get a sense of what it was like in I was alive in 1985, but I wasn't certainly, as a 12-year-old, I couldn't afford to buy a $50 CD box set, or they were all cassette, LP, and CDs. And I didn't have a sense of, you know, what the reception was. And the reception wasn't as sort of historically retrospective as I wanted it to be, but all of the reviews of Biograph, for example, were reviews of Bob Dylan's career. And so there was this sense that Cameron Crowe's liner notes for the set, which are fantastic. He's a great writer, and he did a really good job. It's interesting to look at the set because it doesn't fall into the same sort of box set tropes that we have now. The book, there's no information in the book other than the liner notes, and there are no names or anything. They're all in the back of the thing. The reviews really did start to move into this sort of who was Bob Dylan and what has his significance been throughout his 30-year career at that point. So to watch the trajectory go from these mid-'80s sets to now, you could really see this spike in the historicization of pop music through these sets. Yeah, I don't know. Does anybody else have a question? I keep talking. Terry?
I'm glad you didn't talk about the Marquise. That's an inside joke, a Marvin Gaye joke. I'm exhausted, but I am so thrilled with your talk because of the role of musicology and the stuff that I love as a record collector.
Yeah.
And I think you laid it out very well. I'm also terrified because, and thank you again for the nice comments about Andy and Lauren and the librarian staff and what we've created. We're right at the beginning point of this, so it's always frustrating to think of what we don't have. Mm-hmm. And what really hurt was to think about when I saw what you did, and I was exhausted listening to you, thinking about the resources intellectually you had to pull together to do this. I mean, to listen to this stuff, whereas record collectors would just listen to different takes and opine about certain things, obviously, et cetera. But I go back to Andy, who I don't know if you were involved when we turned down the original Fame tapes. You were probably at that, and you talked about lawyers. It's all about the Benjamins too.
Yeah.
We took the Austin City Limit originals. Part of our obligation was to take all the original videotapes from them and store them in Iron Mountain. And that's an expensive process for a limited resource institution, and particularly a library that has a sort of an operating reserve under it. And I'm just telling folks more about what's going on here. And the folks at Fame, the halls, asked us if we wanted the tapes. And I did, of course, but I was sort of talked out of it. Mm-hmm. Now I'm sitting here with incredible regrets, thinking, that first version of When a Man Loves a Woman that wasn't complete and was brought to the halls, and they turned it down. Is it in there? Could you? And again, for the musicological reasons, not the record collecting reasons. So I share that with you to let you understand it's a learning process, and Andy and I will discuss the famed tapes later tonight. So.
Well, it's even interesting from within the business. So most of my experience, it's interesting because Dan has experience with Rhino and I have experience with Hippo. So we've got two of the three sort of knocked off. With the Universal stuff, it's all at Iron Mountain too now. I mean, there was a time when Harry Wonder, my main contact, and Andy Scaro, who's the vault, the guy who knows everything about all the vaults, where all the tapes are, and he doesn't even need to see them, where they had physical access to this stuff. They could go back to shelves and pull things off and do their own transfers. But now it's all at Iron Mountain, and there isn't. It's great because it's safe, and there have been devastating fires in these archives in the past, and we've lost a lot of really important stuff. And so you want it to be there, but at the same time, it's hard when, as an academic, and you even have the access, to make a phone call and say, do you have I called at one point and I wanted a Boyz II Men tape. Do you have a Boyz II Men multi-track? And he said, yeah, well, I can get it, but it's going to cost, $1,500 or whatever it is to get a transfer of it. And so there becomes these, it is all about money. There become these cost considerations that are challenging for research.
When I first walked into the famed studios, it was this magical moment because I'm from Alabama.
Oh, yeah.
And we're going through the two studios, and there were two small rooms right next to the studios, and one had multiple copies of every 45 and LP they'd ever put out, of which I requested one copy of each. But right next to it was another small unsecured room with the masters, and I was flabbergasted.
Yeah, you gulp. Right.
I couldn't, and then they very sort of just nonchalantly said, "Do you want to take these?" I'm thinking, what? And there's a great responsibility and a cost that went with it, and so it's this has enlightened me a lot, and I think hopefully it makes us think a little bit more about what we do in the future, even with certain financial responsibilities.
Yeah.
And Andy knows a lot more about that. No.
Yeah. It's tough. I think the perception in the public is that all this stuff is safe, and it's all fine, and it's all accessible, and it's really not. And so organizations like this that are actually forging the relationships and figuring out how to do this, which is very challenging, very expensive. There's a lot of politics involved. It's great. It really needs to happen. And I think it's a lot more challenging than the average person who buys these sets realize. That there's a lot of music that keeps circulating, and there's a lot of music that is lost. I mean, even going back to the Cylinder and 78 eras, a lot of that stuff isn't available. And it's hard to make things available. Once they are in digital form and in modern formats, it's easy to push them around and put them into different sets and greatest hits things and things like that. But the things that are back on the dusty shelves in someone's basement or in someone's garage or in Iron Mountain, that's the line that's difficult to cross. It's important work, though. I mean, this is the history of the music we're talking about, and to really bring a musicological perspective to it. You want to have a broader scope of what these things are. You want to be able to see all these things and have access to them all. So it's almost we're at this critical juncture between, the pure academic world of having access to things, which is really false. It's not really true, and this sort of commercial proprietary world where things are. Not only do they cost money to house and store and transfer, but they also have value in the marketplace. And so to give someone Marvin Gaye tapes is running the risk of them letting them go to some, Japanese collector who's going to bootleg them all, and then you lose. No offense to the Japanese, but you lose access to this, and you want to keep it in until you can let it go because it's worth money. So it's very tricky. It's a very tricky world. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Andy. I'm curious about your delicious listening experience with the primary source material. I'd like you to recreate that for me in terms of the kind of studio setting that you might have employed and in terms of the time frame that you had with these fabulous primary source music materials?
Well, so this is one of the benefits of being in 2012 and doing this stuff. So I never touched the reels. You know, I got metadata and transfers of everything. But the beautiful thing about that is that, you know, with a laptop and a set of headphones, you can be anywhere and you can really work with these materials. And so I did most of the sort of preliminary listening work in my academic office with, you know, with a nice pair of studio monitors and a Pro Tools setup. And I was able to very deliciously, I like the word, go through these reels and really explore what was on them. It's challenging because there are things on the horizontal plane that you want to listen to. So, you know, you want to listen to things in time and make sure that everything is, catalog what things are, different takes of things. But there are also things on the vertical plane that you need to, you know, within the track setup, and I'm thinking of a, you know, digital audio workstation world, where you might listen to something and think, oh, well, this is the released take. I know this, right? But it's in multi-track form. But then you need to account for every track that's there. And there were times when, for example, a main theme for Trouble Man 2, the one that we heard with the two voices, there's a string track there that's not on the released. And in fact, John Morales highlighted it in his mix. It's not on the final released version. And so to realize about a minute and a half in, wait a minute, am I hearing strings? And then go back and put the original record on, and you know, I've done my inventory of what I'm hearing on these things, but things are obscured in mixes all the time, and so I go back. Are there strings on this? And you know, you listen for exposed moments, and no, the string track isn't on there. They decided not to use the string track. Aha, we have an extra string track. So it was a lot of fun. It really was, to really, really examine the reels and to know where everything was. It takes a lot of time, but it's fun. It's one of these things that, you know, you lose yourself and it's 3 o'clock in the morning. So then the editorial work, the real editing work, I did with a colleague who is who's a real sort of, you know, crackpot Pro Tools editor. He worked with me at the facility where I worked before at the Shenandoah Conservatory in Virginia, and he teaches, you know, studio techniques. So he's completely up on all the latest editing programs and how to do things very quickly and efficiently. And so I was able to sit there with a notepad and say, okay, we need 8 seconds from, you know, 6 minutes in this reel, followed by 15 seconds of, you know, right at this point in this reel, and then we need to cut and paste this 3 times, and he was able to just keystroke and, you know, move. So we went very quickly. And it was a real godsend to have someone like that around, who again was an academic. And so he was able to do it for nothing. I mean, in a sense, he was able to do it because he really wanted to work on a Marvin Gaye project. And people who teach audio recording often don't get to do enough of it. They really get their hands dirty in working with sources like this. And so he was just thrilled to work on this project. So it was fun. And it was, thanks for asking about it, because it really was a magical time to be able to go through tapes. I have a fair number of these Motown multi-tracks, and it's always exhilarating to be able to mute tracks and to really get inside. There's a movement, one final thing I'll say before I let somebody else talk, there's a movement within musicology to really consider the recording as the primary source. We really have to think about the sort of what word we use is ontology, you know, what is the source, and the recording itself is what we really need to be looking at. But what's so interesting about this is that you realize that the recording itself is made up of all these other sub-recordings, and that when you get into the multi-track recording process, if you can really get a layer under that, then you can learn so much more about what goes into that recording and all the editorial and production choices that were made to get the recording, and mastering and mixing choices to get the recording to sound the way it is that you love. So it's like it's taking a step deeper into the recording process to really analyze these audio sources in this way. So it's fun. Jason.
That was great, Andy. Thank you. And actually, you just sort of started answering the question I had already.
Good.
So it's a good
Well,
kind of play on what you were just saying there. You know, you were talking about the different types of mixes that you might do of the material, the one you had versus the one that ended up on the reissue.
Yep.
And what I was thinking was interesting is when you're listening to those multi-tracks, in many cases, the way those would have probably been recorded is that they would have done some additional, maybe throwing reverb or things on it at the time they were mixing it down to a master. So in fact, even the best attempts to try and get it to be as authentic as it possibly could by doing nothing to it, even the volume levels, because there's unless was it ever notated that you had a mixing list to see sort of what levels the different tracks were? Right, so you wouldn't even really have known exactly where it was. So I was wondering if you could just talk about that. I mean, it might in some ways be impossible to ever actually get an authentic mix of what was intended of a track that didn't end up on the album.
It is impossible, and that's what's so different with. It's not completely different because I completely respect the mixing and mastering processes on jazz and classical reissues because there's a lot of creativity in those too. I don't know if you've ever heard a track before, even a classical or jazz track before a mastering engineer gets a hold of it, or you send, if you have a little bit of money, send the same track out to 3 different mastering engineers and you get it back and it's going to sound very different. I mean, their work is very creative. But at the same time, this is a step earlier than that, and there's no way to know. I mean, you really have to step forward and do the creative work to finish the process. Interestingly, at Motown, especially in the Detroit years, which was right before this, a lot of times they printed compression and reverb onto the tapes. Yeah, so I mean, if you ever been to the Motown Museum, there's the famous part of the tour where they show you where the reverb chamber is in the ceiling. Everybody remembers that. And you stand under it and you clap and you can really hear it's one of the most famous reverb chambers in the history of pop music with, Gold Star and things like that. Well, it's on the multi-tracks a lot of times. So there's no getting around it. It's there, and they compressed and EQ'd things before they went to tape as well. So yeah, there's no going back after they're on those final masters. Which is good in a sense because you have that reverb sound, and in the case of this stuff, there wasn't a lot of it was totally dry, and there wasn't at least there wasn't reverb or compression or audible compression on most of it. It might have been EQ'd. So I mean, you had to make those choices. And it's very, very challenging it brings up all sorts of issues of creativity and ethics when you're doing that. I mean, you really can't do a dry mix. You can't, unless it's going to be for some sort of really erudite collector, because it doesn't sound good. Yeah.
Did you ever look and sort of consider the way reverb was used on the final record, the original record rather, and then try to use that in those creative moments?
So I didn't make those reverb decisions necessarily.
Okay.
This was the mixing engineer named John Morales, who works out of New Jersey, who is a great. He has a lot of history in the business, and he really intimately knows this world. He worked on a lot of dance music, 12 inches in the 80s. But every once in a while I would broach the topic with Harry, and he would say, "No, we're different. We're not going to try and reconstruct what they're doing. This is a different thing. This is a new project, And so that was his way of dealing with it, just saying, this isn't a historical reconstruction. Now, if you listen to the original Trouble Man record, there is just gobs of reverb on it. I mean, really, it sounds like he's in a tunnel, and which is cool. No pun intended, because he uses the word "cool" all the time. And John used a fair amount of reverb on, there's a lot, it's very wet, all the mixes. But there are all sorts of John Morales things all through the mixes. He loves conga drums. And so anytime there's a conga drum in the track, that was going to be featured. No matter what you wanted, you'd say, "John, turn the conga drum down," and you come back and it would be turned back up. Now he made a lot of those decisions. And there was one, I went to his place in Jersey, and we worked for 2 days, I think, 2 days on working together. And it was sort of me looking over his shoulder while he was making creative decisions and making sure that everything was right. Because there were so many edits, and we just had to make sure, especially with the film soundtrack stuff, it was all instrumental, and so there really wasn't a lot. There wasn't a sort of song structure to go on. And there were errors all the time. We would miss little parts in this, and I would have to go back to my notes. And he was making a lot of the creative decisions. And there was one day when Harry and John Morales and I were in the same room working together, and that's when I really realized their the style of mix that because they work together on lots of things, that it isn't this purist type of mix that there is. And there was actually a moment when so one of the tracks that I played for you, main theme for Trouble Man 2, there are two, I call them backing vocals. Harry thinks they're sort of lead vocals. It's sort of interesting how we both categorize those throughout the thing. And this is a Marvin trope. he really got into this in What's Going On. There are two, if you listen to What's Going On, there are two Marvin voices throughout almost the whole record. And actually there are two mixes of it. There's a Detroit mix and an LA mix, and it came out on the expanded edition. And it's pretty fascinating in '71 to hear what they did with those two voices in the different places. The mix that everybody knows on the record is, long-winded answer, sorry, is the LA mix, in which the voices are right on top of one another. It's right in the middle of the stereo spectrum, and it's heterophony. I mean, it's like sometimes he's together and sometimes he's off, you know, and so, you know, one of the voices will go and do a little trill, and sometimes he's singing harmony with himself. It's really fascinating. And the Detroit mix is great because they're hard pan left and right. So you've got two different Marvins, one in each ear. If you listen in headphones, it's just fascinating to hear. It's like he's almost like he's conversing with himself, right? So I was totally tuned into this, and here he's doing it on Trouble Man. And I really wanted this heterophony. I really wanted this sort of messiness, right? And there were times when Harry would say, no, fix that. You know, like move that over, you know, pull that one down because they're not matching right. And I'd be like, no, I'm the historian. We've got to have it there the way he did it. And he'd say, no, it sounds like crap, you know, like we've got to fix it and make it sound. This is what Marvin would have done or something like that, you know. And so there it was like, you know, purist, integral, right? Like I'm gonna do things, don't do things. And it was a pretty fascinating process to be in. You know, to go back to Lauren's original comment, you know, some academics would have stormed out and, you know, been completely appalled. I'm not putting myself above them, but to be in a place where you're working with a partner from outside of academia, you have to be willing to back up and say, well, okay, we're not going to do it that way. Let's see how you do it. I mean, the guy has way more experience than I do. He's released hundreds of these things. He did all the other Marvin Gaye expanded editions. Who am I to tell him how to do this, right? But it was pretty interesting to see how the sausage was made, I have to say, from a historical perspective, especially as somebody who had used these in an academic way with a particular frame of mind before I was behind the mixing console watching how they would do it, thinking, oh, well, this really represents the session. And now I can go back and look at some of those older expanded edition tracks and really think, oh, okay, well, you know, there may be more creativity infused in this than I thought, you know. It's a pretty fascinating process. Sorry, keep talking.
Did you do you have any opinions or thoughts after spending all this time with it about Marvin as a drummer? And because I haven't listened to this in a long time, but since it's an instrumental album and the percussion is so distinctive in this, and knowing his origins, but not knowing much about what he did in between, if he ever got behind a drum kit or if he ever did this. Do you get any thoughts on that at all?
So that's an interesting question. There aren't, I'll talk for 2 minutes on Marvin as a drummer because that's all I can talk. You know, there's the famous, I mean, you bring this up because it's oft-cited that Marvin played drums right when he came to Motown. And, you know, people say he played on Postman, Please Mr. Postman. You know, that's a sort of a famous quote. Now, there's no way to confirm that because at least there isn't a present way to confirm it, because there aren't instrumental logs. There aren't logs for who's playing on what at Motown for any of the Detroit years. There's lots of really interesting archival materials about the sessions themselves, when they happened, who recorded what versions of things. They were very diligent in that way, but the names, if they exist, are locked deep in the vaults. The only real drummer I know who played on this is Earl Palmer on one particular session, and there are a couple of there are two sessions where the sort of standard LA session guys who played on Let's Get It On, Wilton Feder and all these people, you know, Peak and all these different, this sort of like LA session crew played on these tracks. But other than that, we don't even know who the drummers are. I don't know if Marvin got behind the drums. He plays all the Moog stuff, which is really pretty interesting. This is his venture into the Moog. He had just gotten the Moog from Stevie Wonder, and it's sort of an interesting time because the Moog is just coming into funk music as being this you know, tool for creating these space-aged, cool sounds. And the academic musicologists in the room will know that it had a long history before that. It's like the serious composer instrument of, you know, Milton Babbitts of the world, and the pocket protectors in there trying to synthesize sounds. And if you think of the word synthesizer, it's not this cool sort of keyboard-like instrument. It really is creating sounds from scratch and taking a sine wave or some sort of a sawtooth wave and creating a sound that might mimic some other type of existing instrument. And so Marvin became really fascinated with the Moog synthesizer at this time, which it's really right at the crossroads of the Moog as the instrument of the serious composer and the instrument of the funk band. And that's really it's what Trouble Man is. I mean, there's half of it's orchestral film music and half of it is really sort of get down funk music, and the Moog is right in the middle of it. He played almost all that stuff. And there are all sorts of percussive things on the record. So he would, and you can hear him on the track, literally doing this, or and there's like cardboard, like hitting boards and things like that to add percussive things. Sometimes he uses the Moog as percussion. So there'll be Moog tracks within that are just, and he's literally just hitting a key on the Moog to add a percussive every quarter note or every eighth note. And you pull it out of the mix and it's not quite as fat, and you put it back in the mix and all of a sudden you realize, oh, that's where the beat comes from. So he was very attuned to percussion, but I don't think he was playing many drums at this time. Yeah. Was that 2 minutes or was that longer than 2 minutes? Anybody else? One more. Yeah, sure.
You mentioned Earl Palmer, and I was thinking as you were talking, so I wonder if work like this, and we anticipate there would be more of it, and certainly as a place for musicologists to work in these kind of archives, it seems like this is going to be very, very fruitful, right? But I wonder what happens to the kind of canon for popular music studies as a result of this drive and interest. Do certain eras fall away because we don't have multi-tracks?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about all the stuff recorded in the 50s at Cosmo's studio,
Yeah.
J&M Studios in New Orleans, where what we have is what we have,
Yeah.
or vocal harmony groups, doo-wop groups in the 50s. So you can't do that same kind of exploration. Any thoughts just on the kind of impact of reissues and canon making in that way?
Oh, I think it's, it's definitely something to be aware of. I mean, of course you can't control what you don't have. So it's like all the Atlantic stuff that we were talking about today that was lost in the fire. There's a bunch of Atlantic stuff that's gone from the 60s, like classic Atlantic and Stax stuff. I don't think people are going to stop talking about Stax and Atlantic in the 1960s. It's really important music. But there is other stuff that's probably on the fringes of the canon, of the sort of, and you guys, I'm sure, working here, think a lot about canonizing and what you're including and what you're not. I mean, it's a part of your whole enterprise. And we celebrated and criticized at the same time for doing it. So things that are on the fringes, I mean, Cosimo's stuff, yeah, I think in a sense, it's detrimental to the, no matter how you slice it, it's got to be detrimental to the future historical record if stuff doesn't exist, which is one of the reasons why library and archives like this and like the Southern Folklife Collection and like these other collections Andy and I were talking about last night are so important, because some stuff was gone a long time ago, but there's stuff that's going away daily. I mean, people have these collections, important collections, in horrible, horrible environments. When I worked in graduate school at the Southern Folklife Collection at Carolina in an archive and did collecting trips with the director as sort of the lackey, I mean, I was carrying boxes. We would carry boxes out of places, with water damage on the bottom, and the whole bottom row of stuff was gone. And I mean, we were really, really saving this stuff from just being thrown away 2, 3, 4 years later. So it's still an ongoing concern. But when you look at the things that have already been lost, I mean, I think we just have to, this can't be the center of what historical sort of reclamation is using tape materials. It's just sort of an added flavor off to the side. You can do this. And if you have the tapes and you can get access to them, And you can work out all the legal mumbo jumbo, and you can get all the transfers, and you can get somebody who knows a lot about the music and who understands a little bit about the way the recording worked to sit in front of multi-track tapes or even horizontal multiple takes of things, even if they're just live to 2-track or whatever they are, or live to mono. You can learn a whole lot by having things that might not be able to be put out for the entire public to hear. We work a lot from commercial sources, but the pre-commercial sources are pretty interesting. Dan? One more.
To add on to what Lauren just said, just to not, that we should never give up hope on this stuff because, think of all the 70s tape stuff that fused.
Yeah, the sticky shed syndrome and all that
right,
stuff.
so there's that, and finding radio transcriptions, finding they had just unearthed that super early Elvis appearance just a few years ago. All these things that are in collections, and things keep coming up. Now, we can't get the stuff back from the Atlantic fire, and I weep every time I think about it. But there's always these things always seem to surface. So
yeah, and you don't know where it all is. That's the other really fascinating thing about it. It's like this treasure hunt, and the people who run these archives, Andy, of course, wishes he had a crystal ball and he could locate. Even if you can't get it, you want to know where it is. And people don't always know what they have. When I meet musicians and people who worked in the industry, it's dorky to say it, but to have the conversation when you sit down with someone and say, "Have you thought about what you're going to do with all your stuff?" Because you really feel awkward saying it. But, I mean, here, Terry probably has to have this conversation all the time. But to be somebody who's the recipient of that, and to go into an archival collection where it's been cared for, it's in a healthy environment, it's been cataloged. We think about that stuff with medieval manuscripts and art, but we don't think about that necessarily with Elvis's letters, or even Patti Smith's writings and things that are from the 70s and 80s. Some people in this room do, but I don't think a lot of people in the greater public do. And as I look around I looked around the museum today. I was able to take a couple of hours and look around, and one of the things that struck me, well, two things struck me. The first was I saw a lot of bass guitars, and and it was interesting that here are all these exhibits. This has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but this is one of the things that struck me. All these exhibits about different times and places, and here's 1950s Memphis, and here's 1960s Detroit, and here's New York in the 70s and the punk movement, and they all had Fender P basses. It was like the same bass in every one. Well, this is so-and-so's bass, and this is so-and-so's bass. And it's like, well, they're all playing the same instrument. But the second thing that struck me, and this is what is relevant to our conversation, are all the primary source lyric documents, right? Which I assume are very valuable. And for a musicologist, we think of primary source sketches in a very different way. I mean, there's always music associated with it, right? So it's someone who's written it out, or it's a fair copy. So it's one step from the composer's hand. But it's this really, when the composer turned it over to somebody who could really write legibly, and here's Schubert's tune, and this is what the sort of original sketch looks like. But of course, there's no music on any of these things. That's one of the things that, there might be chord symbols sort of scrawled off to the side, which is like what we would do in band rehearsals and stuff. Well, here are the 5 chords you need to play to make this tune go. They're almost all words. And the second thing is they're almost all scrawled on these random pieces of paper. I mean, I was surprised at how many of them have sort of titles on top of them, or even authors written in. And almost suspicious, like, boy, when has someone ever handed me a lyric sheet that has like the author on it, right? That's a little seems a little odd to me. But at the same time, the sort of frailty of these things, they're not using acid-free archival paper to write their lyrics on. They're using, some discarded receipt from a napkin or something, and then here you go. You have "Smells Like Teen Spirit" written on this thing, and it's one of the most popular songs of the last 25 years, right? So collecting becomes even more imperative when the stuff is really on really bad quality material. We should probably stop. I could keep talking about this forever, right? So thank you very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity.